Welcome back. It's another episode of Why Wasn't It Better? I am your host, Patrick Darms.
And I'm your co-host, Anton Paras.
And we are joined actually by a surprise last-minute guest. We had not originally planned to record this episode with a guest, but we actually had a volunteer in the form of Tyler Van Fossen. You remember him from U.S. Marshals. You remember him from just a couple weeks ago with Pirates of the Caribbean at World's End. Tyler, welcome back for your third
Welcome back,
appearance.
Tyler.
Starting to feel like the bad house guest that never leaves.
We want you here, Tyler. we always love talking movies with you.
Yeah, and this is I'll let you guys get into it more, but I had never seen this movie until a week ago when Pat said, "Do you want to do this?" And I am glad I'm here to do it with you guys, because this was a better Why Wasn't It Better movie than I expected.
I'm glad to hear you say that. Yeah, I was like talking to Tyler on the phone recently and just like joking around, like, we're going to record Airport. You should do it. And he was like, yeah, I'll fine. I'll watch that movie and be on the podcast. So that's how that happened. But Anton, a little admin before we get into things. So we promised our listeners that we would be covering Oppenheimer this season. We may not get to it this season. That is the update on that. We're still waiting because you still haven't seen it. I want to see it
I do
again.
need to see it.
Yeah, and I need to see it again before I talk about it for an hour plus. So
yeah, I'm just too all in on Barbie. I've seen it like 4 times. I need to give Oppenheimer a chance.
You've put Barbie on our list as well, so we're going to be covering that at some point. That was your suggestion.
Yes, and that's probably a really good teaser for the future. So we'll remember to come back to Airport when we talk about that one.
Yeah. So today, we're here to talk about a movie called Airport that I've kind of been teasing for a couple weeks, I guess, at the end of various episodes. So we're going to go back in time to the year of our Lord, 1970. People were dressing like hippies. America was still embroiled in Vietnam. You could smoke cigarettes in airplanes. Richard Nixon was in the first term of his presidency. The Beatles had broken up. Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, and the Bee Gees were just getting started. George Lazenby was the newest James Bond. And it was also the same year that a film called Airport was given to us to enjoy.
Dang. Welcome to 1970.
Yeah, groovy 1970.
I gotta say, by watching this movie, you wouldn't know anybody's a hippie by the way they're all dressed.
Yeah, a bunch of squares.
1970, aka 1952, because without stepping on it too much, one of the criticisms of Airport at the time was that it felt like a dated movie at the time, which is funny.
Right, I think that was one of the famous quotes, right? Like,
yes.
the best. It was like exactly like best film of 1952 or something.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. Some critic said it at the time.
I'd be honored. So, in this large ensemble disaster movie, Mel Bakersfeld, the general manager of a Chicago area airport, must contend with a massive snowstorm and other issues, both work-related and personal, while the troubled Dio Guerrero threatens to blow up an airliner as pilot Vernon Demarest attempts to calm Guerrero down and dissuade him from setting off explosives on the plane. Tensions increase in the air and on the ground, and danger is imminent. Released on May 29th, 1970 by Universal Pictures. Directed by George Seaton. Screenplay by George Seaton, and based on the novel of the same name by Arthur Haley. And starring quite the cast. It's a long one. Starring Burt Lancaster, Dean Martin, Gene Seberg, Jacqueline Bisset, George Kennedy, Helen Hays, Van Heflin, Maureen Stapleton, Barry Nelson, Lloyd Nolan, Dana Winter, and Barbara Hale. At a budget of $10 million in 1970, $78 million adjusted for inflation, with a box office of $128 million worldwide. By the way, that's $1 billion adjusted for inflation. So this is quite a film.
It is. I chose this and I dragged you two into it. We've been making a conscious effort to try to diversify the kinds of films that we cover on Why Wasn't It Better? Newer, older, doesn't matter. We're really open to anything that, fits the parameters of what we've established for the podcast. This film in particular, I would not know about if it weren't for my grandmother and my parents, who I watched it with when I was a kid. I have a very fond memory of watching this particular film with my entire family. It was a couple days before Christmas. I was probably like 12 years old at the time, but we were all kind of riffing on it, and it was a lot of fun. But to your point that you made earlier, Tyler, if it wasn't for those experiences, I probably would not know what this film is, because it doesn't really have any obvious legacy in 2023. But Airport is actually a movie that really does fit this podcast perfectly. And it's strangely one of the most influential movies ever made, and almost entirely forgotten. This is basically what invented the disaster genre, which became a craze in the 1970s. Disaster movies had been around prior to this, but they were mostly B movies. What Airport did was that it leveled them up to a blockbuster level, as well as adding a lot of stars. And it was really the first movie to do that. Now, the 1968 novel written by Arthur Harley was enormously popular, and it was a New York Times bestseller for 30 straight weeks. It didn't do well critically, but the readers ate it up. And just like the novel, the movie did not receive good reviews even when it came out, but audiences went to see this in droves. This was the highest grossing film in Universal Pictures history at the time. It was the second biggest film of 1970, and it remains one of the highest grossing films adjusted for inflation. Anton, you mentioned it, $1 billion in today's money. But it wasn't even the biggest movie of 1970. Can either of you name it?
So, super coincidental. I know MASH released in 1970. Was that it?
That's a great guess, but that's not it.
Okay. Then I have no idea.
A film called Love Story.
Oh, okay. Famous theme from that movie.
Would not, never ever guessed. I would have assumed some war movie or something similar.
Right. Yeah. Love Story probably, maybe it's better remembered than Airport, but I wouldn't call it a surefire classic. I don't know.
I mean, listen, even though I'd never heard of it before, I am very ignorant, so that's one key reason. So I don't want any listeners to feel like they're left out. But also, there's a strong following for this film. And like doing the research, looking into it, there's definitely a strong following for this film. And I love to see that. And there is so much love for this franchise.
Tyler, anything you want to say regarding Airport? I basically volunteered you for this.
So, having seen it now, you mentioned the legacy of the movie and that there is no real discernible legacy. But I think beyond the disaster movie theme, the legacy for me is definitely Airplane.
Yeah.
And to watch this and see some of the brief things that got turned into more or less an entire movie because of this movie, the slapping scene, it's just, I mean, it's one or maybe two slaps in this movie, but turns into a 30-second or minute-long skit in Airplane. It's just a lot of stuff like that just, for me, having seen Airplane a million times, all this stuff starts to make sense for me now. And it is, again, I enjoyed this movie. The 70s were a different time, and I know we'll get into it, but like the way people are dressed, I go through the airport with, gym shorts and a t-shirt on and flip-flops. But these guys are all dressed to the nine.
Yeah.
Thinking of like how a guy could sneak 3 sticks of dynamite through TSA is pretty incredible.
They didn't have TSA.
And then nobody would think any better of it. This dude who, and they get to it in the movie, who looks super nervous and who just cashed in, his last 7 pennies for life insurance. I thought that was all kind of crazy for that to exist in a movie, let alone for it to be a movie that grosses $1 billion.
If he wasn't so stupid and didn't cast suspicion on himself, he would have completely gotten away with it. He's such a bumbling idiot throughout the entire time. Like, he doesn't do anything right.
I mean, he lists off all his bumbling moments to his wife before he even leaves for the airport, and he's just like, honey, I have done everything wrong. The kids don't live with us. I have sold all of our jewelry. I haven't held a job since I got out of the Army. I have a strange infatuation with blowing things up that's coming from the Army, and here we are now, just Dynamite Dio with nothing left to lose.
Great acting from him. He gives a really good performance. It's his final role. Van Heflin, that's the actor's name. Really good in the role. You kind of feel bad for the guy. He's such a loser. No one else. I felt bad for him a little bit.
He sells it when his wife scrapes out her tips from the tip jar and hands it over to him and says, "Don't lose this," basically.
Yeah.
He sells it. He is definitely a loser.
Yeah. So this movie, we're talking about it like it's a soap opera because it basically is a soap opera. That's what I find so interesting about this movie. Like, this is what audiences wanted and got in 1970. It's very much like a Da Vinci Code of the era, where if you think about the Da Vinci Code now, when it came out, it was a phenomenon, and it doesn't really have legs anymore. Like, I don't know who's clamoring to read or watch Da Vinci Code now. Like, no one.
Not even Tom Hanks.
No. And they made sequels to the Da Vinci Code. They made sequels to this film too. But unlike the Da Vinci Code, this was nominated for, believe it or not, 10 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. The list of films that have been nominated for like double-digit Oscars, I don't think it's long. And it actually did win an Oscar. Helen Hays won Best Supporting Actress for her performance as the stowaway. And this is consistently ranked as one of the worst films to ever be nominated for Best Picture. And that's why I think this makes such an interesting choice for this podcast. I mentioned the sequels. Over the next decade, 3 sequels would be made. Airport 75, which came out in 1974 for whatever reason. Airport 77 and The Concorde ... Airport 79. The first 2 were hits. The third one completely flopped. I'm about to list a bunch of movies, so let me know if you guys have heard of most of these, because I'm wondering if the listeners have. If you're an older listener, chances are you've heard of the list I'm about to rip off. If you're younger, maybe not. So in the years following this movie, Airport, a slew of star-studded disaster movies would come. Ready? The Poseidon Adventure, The Towering Inferno, The Hindenburg, Earthquake, Black Sunday, The Black Hole, Meteor, The China Syndrome. Most of them were not well received critically, but nearly all of them did amazingly well at the box office. And that's the legacy of this film, right? Nobody remembers Airport, but they remember this entire genre that Airport spawned.
I think I've seen maybe 3 of those movies you listed. I think I've seen The Poseidon Adventure. That's the one with the boat, right?
Yeah, where it like capsizes.
Flips over. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I've seen The Towering Inferno. I think everyone's seen that one.
Yeah, those are pretty famous.
And I've seen The Hindenburg, but I have not seen the other ones you've listed there.
I haven't seen them all. I've seen The China Syndrome, which is like a really good movie with Jack Lemmon and Jane Fonda and young Michael Douglas. That's a good movie. If you ever get a chance, check that out. But yeah, I mean, like, we're just going through that list. Uneven quality, I would say. Like, I've never seen The Black Hole. It's probably not good. I'm going to go out on a limb. But yeah, I mean, that's the legacy of this movie. And the disaster genre, when we were kids in the 90s, there was a revival of this, ready? Like Independence Day, Twister, Daylight, Titanic, Armageddon, Deep Impact, Volcano, Dante's Peak. This went all the way up to Day After Tomorrow, which is another movie that we're going to cover on this podcast, Anton. I've added that to the list because the 20th anniversary of that film is coming up next year.
I hate to say it, but most of those 90s movies you listed, I do enjoy. Independence Day is great. Twister is great. I see it on TV all the time, and I have to watch it. Armageddon, maybe a little too long, but great. Volcano and Dante's Peak, incredible movies because they're so bad.
I was going to say, like, those are probably the weakest of that list.
Dante's Peak with Pierce Brosnan just doing whatever he can, and Terminator Lady just struggling to make it seem like they're romantically linked.
Is Volcano the one with Tommy Lee Jones?
It is, yeah, where they blow up the building to divert the hurricane, or the volcano. Incredible.
I don't remember this at all. They blow up a building to divert a volcano?
Yes. The volcano is under Los Angeles, too.
Does he slap anyone in the movie?
I don't know. I don't think he physically assaults anyone. He might, though.
Because at least, I think, Anton, did you say this or did you, Tyler? At least 2 people get slapped in this movie.
It was me, yeah. And they're very vocal, they're very physical slaps, too. I mean,
they're real slaps.
Yeah. I don't think you can fake it back in the day. There's no CGI slapping.
It's also one of the earliest examples of a studio attempting to make this into an actual franchise. George Kennedy's character would reappear in all 3 sequels. Shout out to George Seaton, who directed this as well as wrote the screenplay. He is probably best known for directing the famous Christmas movie Miracle on 34th Street, which he won an Oscar for writing that film screenplay. And it seems like none of the actors took this film seriously, but they ended up it ended up working out quite well for all of them. Every single one of their careers was boosted by this film. And just in the interest of time, I guess I'll read through the production history. Arthur Haley, who wrote the novel, he also wrote a novel called 0 Hour, published in 1957, which was also adapted into a movie. And Tyler, that novel is actually the plot that would provide the inspiration for the legendary spoof Airplane.
If I remember correctly, the producers of Airplane had to buy the rights to that movie, and there are scenes, like word for word and action for action, taken from 0 Hour. The scene with Timmy in the cockpit is like a one for one adaptation of the kid being in the cockpit until the captain becomes kind of a pedophile.
Right, and
but until that point, Yeah, until that point, it is like taken verbatim. Even getting the miniature plane is verbatim from Zero Hour.
That's hilarious. Oh, and I have to imagine too, a lot of these disaster movies, I think a lot of them ended up going away because of Airplane. Like Airplane hit that so hard that they didn't become cool in the 80s. And they didn't make a lot of them after that anymore.
It's funny to think how that happens kind of frequently. With all of the was a Scary Movie that came out and just blew up all those Scream and all those kind of movies that were coming out, Final
Right.
Destination. And you
Right.
just have one movie come out and totally disrupt that franchise and all those kind of movies. And it's just, I mean, think about it. It took, what, 10, 15, 20 years for Scream to come back? That's the modern iteration of it because Scary Movie had just gone after them so hard.
Yeah, and it's the same problem. Like Daniel Craig talked about the challenge of having to do a post Austin Powers James Bond movie and all like the hurdles that presented to them, which makes it even curious why they brought Blofeld back when they did, Inspector. But regardless, back to Airport. So to prep for this, I actually read the novel, and I was surprised at how easy it was to read. It's pretty entertaining. It's not like I wouldn't call it prestigious literature, but I enjoyed it. And this was also partially based on actual events. The first domestic terrorism incident involving a passenger plane was when Continental Airlines Flight 11 from O'Hare Airport in Chicago to Kansas City blew up over the Iowa and Missouri towns of Centerville and Unionville on May 22nd, 1962. So that's part of the inspiration for Arthur Haley's novel. Now, most of the filming for this was done at Minneapolis St. Paul International Airport. Now, at first, the crew were forced to use bleached sawdust as a supplement to make up for the lack of falling snow until a snowstorm hit the Twin Cities during production, which I guess saved them money. The production actually loaned an actual Boeing 707 for filming. All of the exterior shots you see are real. The plane they used enjoyed a very long career until it crashed in 1989 while landing in Sao Paulo, Brazil. The set built representing the interior of the 707 was left standing at Universal Studios, and it was eventually joined with the 747 interior set constructed for Airport 75. Both sets were used extensively in other Universal films and television series, makes total sense, before finally being dismantled in 2002. Just as filming began, the director, George Seaton, he got very sick. So over the next few weeks, all of the exterior footage in Minneapolis was directed by a fellow named Henry Hathaway. Now, Burt Lancaster, the actor who headlined the movie, he was a veteran actor by this point. Very famous actor by this point. He made a great deal of money from this movie. His contract gave him 10% of the film's gross once the movie hit $50 million. So it grossed more than double that. And it grossed $50 million in North America alone. So, especially in $1970, pretty well done, Burt Lancaster.
Yeah, cheers to that. Imagine anybody getting that kind of deal today.
Yeah, I mean, that's really good money now. And he was getting that in 1970. Despite getting paid that money, Lancaster described the movie as, quote, the worst piece of junk ever made, end quote. Dean Martin also received 10% of the film's gross, which added an additional $7 million to his salary. Alfred Newman composed the score. It would be the final work of a very long career. He died before the film's release and received a posthumous Oscar nomination for his work. And I wanted to bring attention to Alfred Newman's name because this is the same Newman family that Thomas Newman and Randy Newman belong to. Little tidbit there. Alfred Newman was like a major Hollywood film composer who worked for a very, very long time. And one of the passengers in the movie on the plane itself, they complained that they had to pay a $747 ticket price. And they got stale nuts. So that's like $3,500 in today's money. Flying was expensive back then. Now, since the introduction of the MPAA in 1968, very few G-rated films have received an Oscar nomination. This for Best Picture. This is one of them. Other films that were rated G and also nominated for Best Picture include Oliver from 1968, Funny Girl, also from 1968, Fiddler on the Roof from 1971, Sounder from 1972, Beauty and the Beast from 1991, Babe from 1995, and Toy Story 3 from 2010. And that is it for the production history.
hard to imagine this movie still being rated G today.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised it wasn't rated PG then, because there's some light profanity, and it's got, I mean, would you say it's just like, it's just
it's
not a movie for kids at all?
No, everything is an adult theme here. I mean, you're talking about a suicide bomber. You're talking about a bunch of people with, all sorts of things going on in their lives. You're talking about
pregnancies.
Yeah. And then you see these other movies that are G movies that received a Best Picture nomination. Oliver, Fiddler on the Roof, Beauty and the Beast, Babe, especially.
Right.
Toy Story 3.
No, I mean, you're right. There's no way this movie would be rated G now. And this is a good question, Tyler. Like, would this movie even be made now?
It would not be a $1 billion movie today. I can tell you that. Whether or not it gets made, it would be. I mean, this gives TV movie vibes, or TV series vibes.
Soap opera.
Yeah, there's a TV show on Apple Plus right now that is more or less the same idea with Idris Elba, where there's a terrorist on board and he's negotiating with the terrorists. And it's a 10-episode limited run series. That's just the way they do things like this now. They don't make 90 or 2-hour movies based on this kind of concept, because I don't think it would land. I think it would be a very boring movie. And as we talked at the top, it would be like CGI. Everything would be CGI.
Yeah, and you're right. They would make some kind of a variation of this movie, but it wouldn't be a $1 billion movie. There's no way. It would be some kind of direct to video, like streaming Netflix type of deal.
And again, like the concept of someone getting on a plane with a bomb, if you were to try to modernize this movie, it just wouldn't work.
No. No.
And it's someone sneaks something onto the plane that might harm someone, but I mean, you can't make this movie based around a guy with a box cutter threatening to blow up the plane or anything like that. It's just not going to work.
No. First of all, it wouldn't work logically for the plot, and then, like, would audiences even be receptive to something like that anymore? Probably not.
I think violence and explosions, airplanes these days is kind of taboo. I think it's something you try not to talk about or anything.
Yeah, the rating of it is interesting, because this is basically a soap opera more than it is a disaster film. You could make a strong case for that, right? Like, the actual disaster doesn't occur until way past the halfway point in this film, right? You're not even introduced to the bomber Guerrero until I think about 30 minutes into the movie.
This would definitely be I won't say enjoyable. I don't know how much I enjoy a soap opera, but it would be rewarding as a series with this bomb thing kind of going on in the background, and showing these intrapersonal issues that all these people are having around the movie. Again, you see just from quick stop-ins with all these different people about, the one guy's having marital issues and he's never home because he's always at this airport, or the pilot who's, basically embracing the 1970s pilot life, if I understand it correctly. And even the dude's wife says that, well, he always comes back. And I hate to frame it in a more modern way, but she basically is proud of being his bottom bitch. And I don't know why someone would be so proud of that. And then you have the counterpoint with it, which is the other pilot in the plane going, my wife was a stewardess. She knows what goes on with the pilots, and she made me swear that I wouldn't be like that. Down to the old lady who, you want to punch her the whole time because she's doing such a good job of being this kind of annoying old lady who's breaking the rules and doesn't feel any of the consequences.
She's the most unrealistic character in the movie, even more so than the bomber. You can't stow away on a plane.
Not today, and not in the way she does. She'd be like running on the tarmac, trying to jump in the wheel well as the plane's taking off.
I can't imagine. I haven't looked into it, but I can't imagine it was really that easy to do then. I think they were just doing some movie stuff.
I don't know, man. Things were so much different back then. People were generally nicer, and I don't think it was as obvious, especially for an old lady like that, to sneak herself on.
Right. People were more trusting back then.
Yeah, and I think a little old lady like that who's just like, oh, my son dropped his wallet. I need to take it to him on the plane. Or, she goes through all the scans. She's like, oh, my friend has the first class lounge pass that she just lets me borrow. But you get the feeling this woman has definitely stolen that pass.
here we go. All right, we're back. So,
All right,
Anton, you're back after some technical difficulties. No big
wouldn't you
deal.
wouldn't you believe it? I had the weirdest situation where it was a bit like the film, in which case there was a hostage situation in my room and had to get it defused with the help of Dean Martin. But thankfully, it was fixed and we can continue to record. So no time lost, right?
No time lost. I'm really glad that Dean Martin was able to help you. Or at this point, the ghost of Dean Martin.
Yeah, that's shouts out to the ghost of Dean Martin.
Well, if you can
Thank you.
fly a plane in a movie, what can't you do?
Yeah, fair enough, fair enough. Well, I'm
So
ready
that
to
was the production history. And, some thoughts. Let's talk about why this wasn't better. And similar, I think, Anton, to the Mission Impossible episode, we've got two kind of general reasons that are centered around the criticism that this film received when it was released in 1970. The first reason is that the main criticism of this film is that it feels like a much older film, that it feels like it's out of time, which I do think is fair. If you got a chance to watch the trailer of the movie, they do absolutely present this movie as some kind of soap opera. And Anton, we were trying to nail down this quote earlier. Critic Judith Christ famously dubbed this the best film of 1944.
That was it.
Yeah. And seeing the criticisms of it, I do think that's fair. Tyler, I think you pointed this out earlier. There's really no indication with the clothes even that this is set in 1970. They are dressed like you would see people dressed in like the World War II era.
There is no way to tell what time period they're in or when they're there. And maybe that's just because America and things were nicer back then. I don't know. The expectation of flying was that it was a high-class adventure. And I think I said it before, I fly shorts, T-shirt, and flip-flops now. And I think even I'm dressed up for some of the flights I get on. So I can't imagine needing all of that clothing just to get on the plane at any point.
Or was flying expensive back then? It must have been, right?
Yes.
Like it's
Yes.
quite the luxury for a lot of folks. So
it's a really small detail in the film, but at one point a passenger complains about the ticket being nearly $500. So this was before
Back
the
then.
airlines were deregulated. So
Yeah.
it was definitely more expensive. But as you could see, obviously this is just a movie, but the history supports this. Flying was definitely nicer then. The seats were better, bigger. The food was better. The service was better. You just had to worry about secondhand cigarette smoke. But chances are that you would be smoking, so it doesn't matter.
Not like you're flying on Frontier Airlines back then, where you don't even get a tray on the seat.
No. No. Oh, you want to see? You have to pay extra for that. One of the details I really remember from the novel is that all of the alcohol served in economy class, every drink was $1. $1. So film critic Pauline Kael, she gave this one of its worst contemporary reviews. She scornfully dismissed it as, quote, bland entertainment of the old school. There's no electricity in it, and every stereotyped action is followed by a stereotyped reaction, end quote. Charles Champlin of the LA Times, he called the film, quote, breathtaking in its celebration of anything which used to work when Hollywood was younger and we were all more innocent, end quote. Again, I think this is all fair criticism,
Yeah.
but I almost find that a reason to like this movie now. It's almost like retro likable. As a little test, I asked my wife to sit down and watch a little bit of it, and then I was like, well, what year do you think this movie came out? And she guessed the 50s. So
Yeah, that's
kind of says it
interesting.
all.
I think where I landed in terms of critical review is actually more in between Pauline and Charles. So it's not I don't think it's a breathtaking celebration of anything, but I don't necessarily think that the old school's taking away from how good it was. I think it landed nicely in the middle.
I agree with that. Like it does feel like an older film, but that in of itself doesn't necessarily make it bad. But some of the stuff is unavoidable. Like the cinematography, it definitely looks like an old movie, especially when you compare it to contemporary films. Like Anton, you mentioned MASH earlier, or something like The French Connection, where those are filmed in a much more like naturalistic type of way. And everything in here is in focus, but it has that old time movie trope where it looks like everything is being lit from the front with like super bright white lights. Now that works for the interior scenes, but like you see the same lighting when it's supposed to take place outdoors, like when they're trying to dig the plane out, like the lighting looks similar to all the interior stuff. And there was even scenes set in the cockpit where it was so flat looking, I thought it was like rear projection. I don't know if either of you noticed this. There was a couple scenes where it looked like the film quality that they were using was like not the standard of what was used for the rest of the movie. And it's like almost like they had to fix something in post.
Oh, that's a good catch. I don't think I caught that, but interesting. Okay.
And seeing this in 4K, or I'm assuming it was 4K, it almost works against the film because you can really tell how cheap some of the sets looked. Like Guerrero's apartment, it looked like something you'd see in a stage play. Nothing
Well,
looked real. And then the scenes where like the plane is experiencing the turbulence and you see the crack in the ceiling, like it's like pretty clearly just plywood that was painted. Little stuff like that, it starts to add up. You really notice it, especially in a lot of these, some of these older movies. You really notice stuff like that when it's like when you see it in high def.
yeah, I thought I was seeing a leather chair speak in the film, but it was actually just Dean Martin.
I think you catch that right from the beginning of the movie when they're doing the intro scenes and they're just showing the airport parking lots and people are walking through basically dry parking lots with snow on the ground, and they have the snow like kind of filtered in on top of it as an after effect to the scene.
Right.
And it's like,
Yes.
you guys, it's clearly not snowing there. You're not fooling anyone. I guess on an old school projector way back in the day, it would have been harder to tell, and maybe 4K cleans it up to the point where it makes it a little bit more noticeable that they're walking through a dry parking lot with snow kind of. There's some snow on the ground, but it clearly hasn't snowed in several weeks, and it's definitely not snowing in the bright daylight in the parking lot.
But
I'm
maybe,
sure it was safe to be on set when they were using all that bleach sawdust. Like that's healthy to breathe in.
But maybe we're being a bit harsh for something in the product of its time. I mean, in 1970, people probably saw this and said, damn, that looks like snow.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, maybe we are nitpicking. One of the things that really, I don't think this is a small nit to pick. The music composed by Alfred Newman is like laughably inappropriate in some parts. The score dates the film in a particular way. You can tell this guy, nothing against Alfred Newman, but he probably scored all the movies that he scored the same way from like the 30s up until this movie. The one scene where Guerrero is leaving his apartment, remember, he meets his wife at the cafe to ask her for money. And then he takes a bus to the airport, and it's like all he's doing is getting on the bus and sitting down in his seat, and the score is like bum bum bum, like super dramatic. It's like there's really nothing going on here to deserve that kind of music.
Oh, it was very cheesy and very inappropriate.
Yes, although if they were trying to go for the soap opera thing, maybe it was appropriate in a way.
Right. Oh, I mean,
maybe, I don't know.
It's a bit too on the nose then.
Yes, it is. You mentioned it earlier, Anton. One of the things that's aged kind of the worst and the best about this movie at the same time is like the time capsule element. They're serving shrimp cocktail in first class. They're getting sherry served to them in economy. Like that's nothing you would see like that now. Nothing even close to that.
No, you're going to get a little thing of, you get a little airline bottle of vodka and a Red Bull. That's what you're going to get. Nothing classy.
That's what you get when you fly, vodka Red Bull?
Say, Anton, that's a dangerous choice in an airplane.
Yeah.
I saw it happen. I didn't actually do it.
Are you sure? It's the first thing you thought of.
All right, we're going to cut this from the recording. If you leave this in.
I have a weird drink of choice on planes. So for whatever reason, I like the Bloody Marys that they serve on planes. Can't tell you why. I like it.
I don't like to pay extra for a Bloody Mary on a plane, but I do just like drinking the V8.
Yeah, I mean, surprisingly, drinks aren't that expensive on planes. You'd think they'd be more. Like they're like $8. It's like pretty good.
That's not bad.
No, it's not. You would just think, given like it's a plane, you'd think the drinks would be like $20. Hopefully, I'm not giving them any ideas.
What's a shrimp cocktail price on planes nowadays?
I would not be surprised if you could get that on like Emirates in first class, but on like a regular American airline, no way.
No. They'd laugh at you if you asked about it.
Yeah.
They'd laugh at you and toss you a pack of peanuts and some pretzels.
The last few times I've flown, they haven't even given us pretzels. They've given us some like weird cookie cracker thing. It's not a cookie. It's not a cracker. It's just worse.
Because they want you to drink, they're making your mouth drier.
Yeah. You know what I'm talking about, right? It's like some kind of like biscuit deal.
Yeah,
I don't know.
The Biscoff cookie, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's it. Yes, that's it. Got worse. But yeah, flying looks pretty glamorous in this movie. I liked how Mrs. Livingston, she's the blonde who Mel Bakersfield is maybe or maybe not having an affair with. I like how she puts together the bomber's story simply because like her friend, the customs officer, like he just thought Guerrero looked suspicious, which of course he did. And I like how the sequence of events that leads to her like connecting the dots, and they're eventually able to like piece together what he's doing when they find his wife.
So Mrs. Livingston was actually a pretty cool character in the film, someone that you're rooting for.
Right?
But were we supposed to be rooting for the adultery?
Okay, I'm glad you brought this up because I was thinking the same thing. I feel like they're presenting it to you in a way that wants you to root for the divorce first
Oh my god.
before, because like it's
Jeez.
never actually stated whether or not he is having an affair with her. Right? They seem to have like
Right.
these. They have strong feelings for one another. They've acknowledged it in the past, but it seems like they haven't acted on it.
Got the opposite feeling.
Oh,
His face when the wife says there's another man, you would assume that if he was not doing the same thing, he'd have a stronger reaction.
Maybe.
I the only reason I thought what I thought was because at the end when he tells her like, how about you make me the scrambled eggs at your apartment that you've told me about before?
His wife kind of says like, you're always at the office, you never come home, you're consistently avoiding me. It just makes it seem like this maybe is the first time they're going to her home to
Oh, that's a good point.
make things official. But they have previously just done it on that couch that they keep showing in the office.
Because they're definitely doing it in the novel. It's not implied. It's definitely confirmed. And then the novel goes into more of his wife's infidelity, like what she's like particularly looking for, what she's already done.
Right, I remember you mentioning that.
Yeah. Really riveting stuff from Arthur Haley. I mean that sarcastically and non-sarcastically at the same time.
And it's funny you've said this before. It is just such elements of soap opera that really make this a glorified soap opera episode.
Yes. People ate this up in 1970. Like that's just apparently what audiences wanted.
Think about how much juicier drama has to be these days for people to be interested in it. I mean, the whole Bravo TV station exists just to be drama.
Right.
I can't imagine.
For drama
This
nowadays, you have to have the international 90-day fiance.
I did not even realize Bravo was still a channel. I have not heard the name Bravo in years.
It's the Housewives channel.
Oh,
right?
is it? Is that what it is?
Yeah, I'm pretty
Okay.
sure.
Yeah,
It
come
would
on over
make
to-
sense for them to like air this movie.
This is definitely not salacious enough to be on Bravo.
It's way too tame. There's
say,
just
come
a
to-
little infidelity
it's way
going on
too-
here. Nothing crazy.
Come,
Maybe.
yeah, come to my house where Bravo is on 24/7 and my wife's watching it, and it is nowhere near dirty enough. This would be like something that Cartoon Network shows these days. Is this kind of movie?
Yeah, this is closer to Lifetime films.
Oh, Anton, so when you were dealing with your technical difficulties, one of the things Tyler and I were talking about is that this film is rated G, which seemed like a mistake even in 1970, because like this is like the definition of a PG movie, in my opinion.
Right.
And the only reason it's not PG-13 is because PG-13 literally didn't exist yet, and that's the other crazy part, is it would have been elevated beyond PG
Right.
these days.
Yeah,
That
like there's
taken-
nothing
yeah.
even like remotely bad in it. Like a kid could watch this movie, but it's certainly not for kids. That's why the G rating like just befuddles me.
I think maybe it was the guy blowing himself up in an airplane that would have made me bring this up another level, but G
Right.
does not seem appropriate. Dean Martin's in it. That's family friendly.
Yep, Dean Martin and his medium rare skin. Seriously, that guy, he must have been hitting the tanning booth between takes because he was crispy.
He didn't have to hit the tanning booths. He just took lots of walks in Vegas.
This film is supposed to be in Chicago in the middle of the winter, and he is walking around like he just spent 6 months in South America somewhere. It's incredible.
I'm sure the like 3 packs of cigarettes that he was going through a day like contributed to this.
If only it was that many.
Oh, Dean Martin.
Shouts out to Dean Martin.
Yeah,
that's a classic.
I actually
man.
like him in this movie.
Yeah.
Like
absolutely.
he manages to like pull it off as far as like playing a pilot. He pulls it off somehow.
Because he's cool. He's always keeps his cool, and I feel like pilots have to exude that because they're flying a plane. When he's like, giving the directions like tell the girls not to bring the dinner, not to bring dinner out quite yet. Things are gonna get a little bumpy. Keeping it
He has some
cool.
pretty good dialogue in this movie. Some of it's corny, some of it's actually pretty funny. I guess this is a pretty fluid discussion, but we can sort of move into the second reason of why this wasn't better, which is it's
Yeah.
corny. Because that's another major criticism that you hear about this movie, how corny it is. Anton, you made this observation to me, I think, yesterday, that it really stuck with me, and I wanted to bring it up as a discussion point. You mentioned to me how you found many things in this movie funny, but you weren't sure if they were supposed to be funny.
Exactly.
Now, to be fair, there is quite a bit of deliberate humor in this movie. I think Ada Quonset, the character played by Helen Hays, her character is inherently supposed to be the comedic relief.
Oh,
But
right.
to your point,
Yeah.
there is some dialogue in here. You're like, this is outrageous.
I was say I have to wonder the way they address people, where it's Mrs. Livingston and Miss Quonset or Mrs. Quonset. Did people really talk to each other like that back then? Did you address everyone as Mr. and Mrs. what their last name was? I mean, unless I was in school directly addressing a teacher, I don't think I ever called anyone Mr. or Mrs. this or that. And then even as an adult now, would never ever go to someone and say, "Hi, Mr. Whatever. I'm Mr. Van Fossen." That seems not normal to me. And I don't know. Maybe it was a different time, but it seems weird to me.
I think they probably didn't, but in a very formal setting like that airline, maybe that it's something that they would have done. And then the only other thing that makes me think that they did speak to each other like that is that like Burt Lancaster was almost like 60 at the time this movie was made. So he was very much from like the World War II era, and like maybe. But I have a quote here from another review. The Monthly Film Bulletin wrote, quote, "Corny is really the only word for this unbelievably old-fashioned look at the modern phenomenon of an international airport. The one surprise is that the sweet old white-haired stowaway doesn't spring to the controls and bring the distressed aircraft down single-handedly as Doris Day did once upon a time in similar circumstances," end quote. I get it. Like, again, I don't think any of this criticism is particularly unfair. Like, for the first 30 minutes of this movie, this is a straight up soap opera centered around just like a Chicago airport. And then all of a sudden, Guerrero gets inserted into the movie and it just becomes this disaster thriller. But it's a total slow burn. Other than the one scene where he lets the bomb off, there's no action in this movie whatsoever.
Well, there was the really tense scene between the kid that could really identify each star in the sky. And then Dean Martin being like, "Shut up, kid."
Yeah.
Can we take a second to talk about, does that kid know that there is something going on with the plane? The response that he gets from the captain is, to me, a non-aeronautical person. It's a mumbo jumbo. But does this kid understand that there's like something serious with the plane, and that's why he's like, "Don't worry about it," to his parents?
I don't know.
It was such a bizarre scene, honestly.
Like the interaction, they could have skipped that whole 60-second interaction, and it wouldn't have made any difference.
Was that also like their 28-year-old son?
Oh, Anton, I forgot to write that down, but I remember thinking that. I'm like, he's supposed to be like 13 or 14, and like that's clearly a 30-year-old.
Like you said, seeing it in 4K just totally ruins a bit of the magic. But I was like, there's no way that's just a child.
Ruins it or enhances it?
Enhances. There we go. Enhances.
But just think, Tyler, if they had cut that out, which they absolutely should have, it's like a ridiculous scene. But if they had cut that out, that's just less ammunition for Airplane to use 10 years later. Like, imagine if there's like a 3-hour director's cut of this film.
It's a captain going down and shaking everyone's hand on the plane and just talking to them one by one. And each of them has some other observation to talk about. One's the stars, one's, we must be flying over Canada now. Just let's include all of that. Why not? Just jam it in there.
It's wonderful. So one of the criticisms of this film as well is that Variety magazine states, quote, "It does not create suspense because the audience knows how it's going to end," end quote. I completely disagree with this type of argument for this movie. And I'm never a fan of the "we know how it's going to end" argument, because you could apply that to almost any movie. Anytime you go into an action movie or a thriller movie, like you know what's going to happen. You just don't know how it's going to unfold. Especially in this type of movie, right? Like
Right.
obviously the plane isn't going to crash. They're not going to do that. We know how it's going to end. We don't know how they're going to get there. Now, one thing it's not so much in this movie, but in a lot of the subsequent disaster movies that came out in the 70s, it was a question of how many people are actually going to make it to the end. And off the top of my head, just remembering the Poseidon Adventure and Towering Inferno, a ton of the characters in those movies end up dying like really gruesome deaths. Now, this film obviously did not do that.
I'm with you on this. I had no idea that bomb was going off. I even texted you as I was watching the movie for the first time.
Yeah.
And I said it to you. I was like, I cannot believe that dude blew up with the bomb in the bathroom. Like, it just did not. The way they were going and getting there, and they had him basically cornered, and he was ready to give up the bomb.
Yeah, he was going to give up.
And then that one guy just fires out of the bathroom and tries to grab it. Yeah, the other guy who had previously called him out was like, yeah, he's got a bomb, grab him.
Yeah.
First off, that guy should have gone out.
And then
that
before
guy should have gone out the plane.
The idiot who grabs the bag, the guy who grabs the case from the captain. That's the thing. Dean Martin gets the case. Like, he pretty much pulls everything off, and then that one guy's like, you can't touch that. That's personal property.
And I think that's probably the least believable part of the movie, is that some guy who, prior to this, had showed the utmost respect for the captain was suddenly like, oh, the captain's a crook. He's going to steal that bag from that guy. Like, what's he going to do with it? He's on an airplane. You think he's going to run away with it? He's going to throw it out the plane himself? He's going to take it home? Like, there's nothing that captain is going to do with that bag that makes it clear that it is, something that could explode. Like, he's just like, I'm going to take this bag from this guy. Okay, no big deal. If I was on a plane today and somebody took a bag from someone, I'd be like, all right, go. Okay. They're just going to store it under the plane, or they're going to stick it up in the front or something.
Right.
It's not going to be like, oh man, that's his private property and he deserves to have it. Like, that's not at all the case. You're on a plane. You're stuck.
But yeah, when that bomb goes off, I was genuinely shocked. I was not expecting it. I really thought it was going to get diffused. No pun intended. And they don't do it with any like dramatic music. They don't drag it out. There's no melodrama with it. And it's interesting considering the movie is pretty much a soap opera, but they pretty much play it straight. Dean Martin, we talked about him, convincing pilot. He's got a lot of charisma. I never really think of him as an actor, but his acting's pretty good in this movie. And then Burt Lancaster, I really like his performance. And despite the fact that he called this movie a piece of junk and he was phoning it in, I don't think he doesn't come across as phoning it in. I think he gives a really strong performance. And then the guy George Kennedy, who's actually an Academy Award winner, he won an Oscar for Cool Hand Luke. So he's like he was a veteran character actor at this point. He's great as Joe Petroni, and you can see why they brought him back for all the sequels. He's a pretty easy guy to root for.
Oh yeah, solid character.
Yeah.
As soon as I saw him from this, you think of all the other movies that he's in. You think of The Naked Gun, exactly. Yeah. And it's just like, it's hard to believe that this guy had any kind of serious background before he was in The Naked Gun. You have to think of him as just being this goofy guy. But it's funny to see that he never really elevated himself beyond the sidekick.
But he did win an Oscar out of doing it.
Yep.
So he did something right. He's in another movie. Have you ever heard of the movie Charade? Audrey Hepburn's in it with Cary Grant.
Okay.
Pretty cool movie from the early 60s. It's often described as the best Hitchcock movie that Hitchcock never made. But it's that type of movie. It's a thriller.
I already like The Stars Attached. That's pretty great.
It's one of Cary Grant's final films, but definitely worth checking out if you ever see it. The dialogue, for whatever reason, I found myself remembering a bunch of the dialogue from this film. I have to give it props for that. Some of the ones that stood out to me, when you get to be older, there isn't a lot left to be frightened of. I like what Dean Martin says to his stewardess mistress. He's talking about the taxi driver. His meter's running and so is mine. You got me up to full throttle and throw me into reverse. You could damage my engine that way.
And he says it just in his regular Dean Martin way.
On paper, it's a terrible line, but he somehow pulls it off.
It's great delivery.
You can imagine him saying something like that to someone in real life. I think
that's why it works. And then I like what Burt Lancaster, Mel Bakersfeld, says to Mrs. Livingston. He said, if you're wondering if we had another fight, the answer is no. It's just a continuation of the same one.
That's a funny line.
The one that cracked me up the most, Anton, this is a great example of what you brought up. I don't know if this was supposed to be funny or not, but it was hilarious when Dean Martin says to Guerrero, "You'll kill yourself for nothing if you explode that bomb."
He just calls him a loser.
Everyone freaks out. They definitely looked at that when they were making Airplane and were like, we somehow need to recreate this, which they do. If you remember, the stewardess from Airplane, when she says, by the way, is there anyone on board who knows how to fly a plane? And everyone freaks out. It's definitely where they got that from. And then another one that cracked me up, after the bomb goes off and all the passengers are like sitting together, like forwards, and there's like 3 people on a seat and whatever. There's a doctor who tells the stewardess, if you have any brandy, hand it all out.
I mean, what better way to get through that than to get everyone drunk and just be through
Pretty
it?
much.
And their cover for that is like, oh, everyone's cold because there's a hole in the plane. Like, no, you just want everyone to chill. It's okay. We get it.
So let's talk about the Oscar winner here. Helen Hays won the Oscar for this movie for Best Supporting Actress. I think she's amazing in this movie.
Shouts out.
It's a great role.
Oh, 1,000,000%. Just completely sells it and is authentically a great role for her and just a great character. Just hilarious.
Genuinely frustrating. Like,
Yes.
you know, you're watching her. She's sitting there, she's just being like straight up about all this stuff. She's like, yeah, I play the game and I beat the game every time. It's like you never think of watching a movie and wanting to punch an old lady in the face, but here I am watching this movie and thinking, man, this lady she's getting under my skin.
Oh, it's hilarious. She's playing the little old lady thing really well, but you can tell on especially if you rewatch the movie, she's just misleading everyone the whole time.
Oh yeah.
When Mel Bakersfeld is telling her how like it's illegal to stow away on planes, and she's like, I know. I like when she tells them, oh, I didn't eat much on the plane. The beef was a little well done, and the salad dressing had too much garlic in it. I think you should tell them.
Oh, and proceeding right before that, they'd offer her some sandwiches. He said, "Oh, yes, please. I didn't eat much on the plane."
Yeah, that's it.
And so she used that. She double, like she gave them double L's, saying like, "Yeah, I'll take your food," and oh yeah, the food on the plane was also really bad, which I also ate.
I didn't realize this until I did more research on this, but so Maureen Stapleton, who plays Mrs. Guerrero, she was also nominated for Best Supporting Actress.
Dang.
Small role, but she's really, really good in it. You really feel sorry for her. She's not in the movie much, but she makes the most of her screen time. I felt terrible for her character.
Not to spoil the ending, but watching her run around at the end of it, like kind of in a complete panic, knowing that her husband, former husband at this point, is responsible for what happened on the plane and is, could have literally blown everyone up on the plane, and like the pure terror in her understanding that. Even prior to that, where she's sitting there and she doesn't have anything to say, she's in shock and she's like, just sitting there, and they're like, what? She hasn't said anything, she doesn't do anything, she has no money to get back from where she came from. It's all pretty convincing that she is.
Oh yeah. You're talking about the scene when Mel and Mrs. Livingston are like interrogating her and they're like trying to get the information out of her.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's like genuinely great acting from everybody.
Right. Absolutely sells it.
And then so Van Heflin in his final role as Guerrero, right? So he died, I think, before the movie came out. I'm surprised he didn't get an Oscar nomination because he's really good here. I mentioned earlier how much I liked his performance. He definitely is convincing. He comes across as a complete idiot who has no idea what he's doing. And even though he's doing something completely terrible, I really actually felt sorry for him.
He plays a great sap, and it's, again, he's they give him a backstory. They say that, he's a demolitions expert from the war. So he clearly has, PTSD and probably a list of other things going on. And it's just, he sells it well. He sells that he's a loser. He sells that, he has basically lost all control and this is his last and final option. And I think it was awesome to see. And even like him walking up to the predecessor to the TSA guy in the kind of the TSA looking suit.
When he's at the gate. Yeah,
and it's like he plays it well, like he's a nervous guy, nervously doing things that he shouldn't be doing.
Yeah. How many scenes do you think there were of him just like tapping his hands nervously on the briefcase?
Half dozen.
Yeah.
And even the scenes where they show him and he's got the map on top of the briefcase and he's mapping out how long it takes to go from place to place so he can figure out where he needs to detonate the bomb. I thought was an awesome detail. And it's like no one thinks about that. If you're, I'm assuming the mindset of a terrorist bomber here, but no one would think like, okay, I have to measure how long it's going to take for me to be in a
Right.
place where I'm going to blow this whole plane up over the water and not do any damage. And I think it's him trying to do it. So they say later, was it the Atlantic swallows everything? It's kind
Yeah.
of what it's like.
Mhm.
Yeah. So
I think modern blockbusters could learn a lot from this type of character because in not a lot of screen time, they manage to give him a complete backstory. They give him sort of a character arc. Like he sort of almost redeems himself right before he doesn't. It's a pretty well-written character. Like you're right. Like within a very short amount of time, we find out his background, his motivations, his family life. And that's why, because of the writing and because of his performance, you feel bad for the guy. It's more like you pity him.
And shouts out Van Heflin, great performance to really portray that.
So something I wanted to bring up, Barry Nelson, who plays the co-pilot, is, believe it or not, the very first actor to portray James Bond. He did this prior to Sean Connery in a made-for-TV movie version of Casino Royale. He played an American character named Jimmy Bond. Pretty cool little tidbit.
That's fun.
Yeah. That's kind of worth a watch on YouTube. It is genuinely terrible, but it's interesting.
it's hard to imagine the seriousness of, they weren't serious movies, but James Bond walking up and going someone, Jimmy Bond, to anybody would totally throw off the whole framing of the movie, I think.
It's not broccoli approved, is it?
No. So, really, really quick historical tidbit. So, Ian Fleming wrote Casino Royale first. He immediately sold the movie rights to it. So when Eon, the company that made all the official Bond movies, when they acquired the rights to his novels later, it was basically everything but Casino Royale. And that's why Casino Royale, the real Casino Royale, did not happen until 2006.
Interesting. Okay.
When Eon finally reacquired the rights. Back to Airport, Jacqueline Bisset, Smoking Hot.
Enough said.
Yep. Good character, though.
I did a little digging into her Wikipedia page. Pretty credible.
Been in a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Anton, you mentioned Mrs. Livingston, played by Jean Seberg. I like her too. I don't know why she wasn't in more movies. She seems like a pretty good actress. I'd say the best thing you can say about the acting in this movie is, for whatever reason, I actually found myself caring about the characters, which is, I guess, the highest compliment you can really pay this kind of a movie. Because if you don't care about the characters, this movie just completely falls apart. But almost all the scenes, I think, are well acted. For whatever reason, I was rooting for Mel Bakersfeld and Mrs. Livingston. The conversations between Mel and his wife, pretty well acted. It felt pretty real. What I realize is the thing that makes this movie work is, despite being what is just basically a soap opera, none of the actors are overdoing it. Everybody plays it straight. Helen Hays and George Kennedy, they probably dial it up the most, but both of them know when to walk it back. And that's why I think all of it works.
George Kennedy, in the end, when he gets the plane out and he's got the cigar, the unlit cigar in his mouth, and he just chucks it behind him. I think it's probably the most he gets to play it up in the whole movie. And I think it's one of the funnier things where he's just like, yep, did it, done, out of here. Doesn't get another scene in the movie. That's his curtain call in that movie. And I thought that was great.
Right. And then he gets to go home to his wife.
Yep.
What did you guys think of the split screen stuff?
I honestly loved it. I thought that was really fun.
Same.
I didn't expect it.
No.
For it to pop up and feel like it's watching the Brady Bunch, I thought it was great.
Yeah, I really liked it. They had a practical use for it, and they stuck with it consistently. They just kept using it, and you're like, this is fine. This works. It makes sense.
I almost want to see some more modern use of it.
The airport lounge where Mrs. Quonset tries to get into after they're questioning her. Pretty baller. It has a fireplace. Again, you'd never see anything like this in an airport now.
That literally just blew my mind. I didn't even put two and two together. I just thought it was like some nice estate where she was getting questioned. That literally is the airport lounge.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Fireplace. It feels like they're in like some like skiing lodge.
They were actually going to film in the actual like lounge set, but it was booked, so they had to took the skiing lodge set to film the scene. I'm sure that was it.
And as far as the pacing goes, the movie didn't feel that long to me, although it had a kind of a lengthy runtime. it's paced pretty well, and I like the fact that it takes place in real time over what I guess would seem like maybe 3 or 4 hours at the most.
They don't ever get out of Canada, do they? They
No.
make it to like the edge of Canada and then they turn around.
They make it to, they're on the radio with Toronto at one point, so that's about as far as they get. And great movie title. This movie's called Airport, and damn if it doesn't give you everything airport. All airport everything. From the
True
first
that.
second to the last, all you get are airports, and they do airports well.
Airport all the time.
Yeah. It's like, this movie is exactly what it is marketed as. It's like, you want to see a soap opera set in an airport, you got it. I do have some positive reviews of this film that I want to mention. Mike Brooks of Manipop, he said, quote, director George Seaton not only populated the film with seasoned actors who could pull off such absurd roles with aplomb, but he also filled the script with very realistic dialogue between the men on the ground and the beleaguered crew aboard the fateful flight, all desperately fighting to bring the plane down safely. With the use of split screens and cool radio chatter, Seaton manages to build a credible amount of suspense, more than what you'd expect with someone like Dean Martin in the cockpit, end quote. I think that's put perfectly. And then another review by Christopher Null said, quote, with one grandiose entrance, Airport ushered in a genre of movie making that is still going strong, the disaster movie. It's too bad the disaster doesn't happen until 2 hours until the 2-hour, 15-minute movie. No matter, Airport's unending sequels and spoofs are a testament that this film is a true piece of Americana for good and for bad, end quote.
Dang, I wonder when he wrote that in 2000.
Yeah,
they
right?
could have done this entire movie without the bomb actually happening. Could have just been an air disaster. It kind of feels like you would have gotten the same effect. Like, oh man, like the rear rudder broke or whatever.
Yeah.
And it could have had the same thing. And you could have just gotten the soap opera that you needed.
Yeah, I guess the actual disaster, it does happen late, which is, that's fair. If the bomb hadn't even been part of the plot, like the movie doesn't change a ton.
I think it's important. I think from when you think of the catalyst is the character who's driven, like internally is driven to set the bomb off. I think that's what drives suspense versus maybe if you carry through the film, you see like, oh, someone hit that rudder and that's not going to go well. And you kind of get continuous shots. There's less motivation there. And from an audience perspective to build tension, I feel like, versus like the intentions of a character that is the villain of the film, or like he's not even he's kind of lame to be called a true villain, but very sad soul.
Definitely a sad soul. No, that's a good point you make. It looking at it like that, it certainly is necessary, because then it to be a disaster movie, it definitely needs the disaster in it. But I agree with that one review. I think this is a really well-directed movie, and there's definitely suspense built. And there is real tension when after the bomb goes off and they're trying to land the plane. It's pretty riveting stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So here's the real question. Are you going to watch the sequels, both of you?
Oh man, like that's a good question. I probably am. Like they were all on Netflix, so why not?
All of them but the fourth one. For what I don't know why.
Well, listeners, if you aren't convinced yet, go watch the film and go watch the sequels and take a part in some U.S. film history.
So, listeners, I will caution you: all these movies drop off of Netflix on September 1st.
Oh, they do?
So we gotta watch soon.
So you're running out of time to catch this and the sequels. So do it quickly.
Do it quickly. You have 3 weeks.
Yeah, let's put that in a YouTube short. Airport and the sequels drop off September 1st from Netflix.
Yes,
Watch
just
them.
Full disclosure, Anton. I expect this to be probably our least popular episode.
I think that's why it's so noble that we do an episode like this, because it's not just about the most popular films. This is a really important film. And
it was a really popular film at one point.
And I think
this is a great film for all of our 60-plus listeners.
Yeah.
My dad, who is 60 plus, he thinks this is a terrible movie. And that brings us to the part where we conclude this, which is, did we like it? Now, Tyler, I know you are on a little bit of a time crunch here, so we will let you go first.
So I'll say I like this movie. I did not expect to like this movie. I think that it definitely captured my attention. It was definitely, again, I texted you as I was watching it to say, I did not expect that guy to blow himself up. I did not expect him to get sucked out of the plane. I did not expect, the circumstances of the movie to be what it was. And I was happy to see the influence that this movie had on disaster movies moving forward and disaster movie parodies moving forward. Seeing the parallels from this movie to Airplane, I thought were incredible. Seeing, again, I think I talked about it before, the slapping scene where the woman gets slapped, and then understanding that that's why that scene exists in Airplane, and that Airplane took that to the nth degree and had that line of people slapping her, and then with the bats and everything. I thought that was awesome. The realistic view of this period in time is something that I am also not familiar with because I wasn't born when this movie came out. This came out 19 years before I was even a thought, and getting an understanding of again, how people addressed each other, how people dressed on planes, how weirdly sexual the airline industry was. I don't know how to phrase that accurately, but I mean,
Unprofessional?
that's an understatement. But again, it's just like hearing people talk about that and the way they talk about it, and it's just it's a weird time capsule, and it is an interesting theme. But overall, I was very intrigued. Getting, a movie doesn't have to be an Avengers movie for me to enjoy it. It doesn't have to be crammed full of CGI for me to enjoy it. The acting was well done. We talked about a little bit about the set pieces being a little funky, but it looks like they filmed it in a plane. It looks like they're sitting in a plane. It looks like there's distinctions between the first class and the rest of the class. The side view of the plane, it gives good aspect to see what's going on. And I was pleasantly surprised, again, from a movie from 1970. When I watch a lot of these older movies, I'm genuinely shocked about how bad they are most of the time. But this was definitely well worth it. If I had to give this movie a rating, it's somewhere between a B and a B minus. It's definitely something I'd watch again. I am not totally sure about watching the sequels, but we'll see if I have time before September 1st.
Oh, they're a hoot. You should.
Yeah,
Let's see.
of all of them, and I know it's the worst rated, but the Concord one kind of cracks me up, just because they had what seems like a reliable concept where it was airport, but are 74 or 75, and then the next one and the next one, and all of a sudden they're just like Concord ... airport, whatever. I think that has probably got to be a sign the movie is going to be radically different and not as good. But again, overall, really enjoyed this movie, and I thought it was great.
Love it. Yeah, definitely see the sequels. You'll like Airport 77 because that is essentially the Poseidon adventure and a plane. The plane crashes in the ocean and sinks to the bottom, and they have to rescue the survivors that are inside.
Why do I
Seems
feel like the
it's-
effects aren't as cool as I wish they would be?
They're not. So Airport 75 and Airport 77 were really popular movies, but the Concorde one completely bombed. And then the next year is when Airplane came out, which just tombstone for this kind of stuff. Anton, did you like this movie?
It was super cheesy, corny, but at the same time, a very simple film. And I say that in the best way possible. I love the way that each character had a very specific role. I mean, it was very clear what each individual character played and how that really molded the tropes of different disaster films and similar films in the future. And I think that's amazing. And even though it's a very simple premise, they were able to do so very effectively with strong actors and with a story that just made sense. So even it didn't even have to be the most complex story to really capture your attention. And even then, I laughed at it, and at parts where I'm sure that they didn't intend for people to laugh at. But that's a bit of the fun of this film. So while it wasn't perfect, there were definitely a lot of key elements that make me appreciate this film, and I'm really glad that I was introduced to it so not only do I give it a B, but thank you, Patrick, for introducing me to watching this film.
With pleasure. Well, we're all in agreement on this. I give this movie a B rating. It is hilariously dated and corny in certain parts. It's very much a product of its time, but I find the whole thing charming. It's a very entertaining time capsule movie. It doesn't take itself too seriously. It's pretty well filmed. I like the pacing of it, the real-time-ness of the story. I like all of the acting. Burt Lancaster and Dean Martin are a great pair of actors to headline a film. The rest of the supporting players, they do well. I mean, Anton, I completely agree with you that like there are parts in this movie that like this is funny and I don't know if it's supposed to be funny. But the fact that I was caring about the characters as much as I did, that's like a major prop for this type of movie. And I have to give it a lot of respect just because of the legacy. The legacy of this movie is not the movie itself. It's in all of the other movies that came after it because of it. And taking that into account, even though this is basically a soap opera set in an airport, it's not trying to pretend to be anything other than what it is. But I actually think it's a really good movie, and there's certain things about it that hold up better than it deserves. And without this film, we wouldn't have gotten Airplane, so it's worth it just for that.
Or Soul Plane.
Or Snakes on a Plane. We can go way down the rabbit hole.
Tyler, thank you so much for joining us in what is essentially a volunteer job by you.
Yeah, of course. Like I said, this is an interesting movie. Not something that would have ever appeared on my radar had we not mentioned it. So many thanks for you guys for having me on again, and looking forward to whatever one I get drafted into next.
Absolutely. The pleasure's all ours. Thank you.
Absolutely. That's it for this week's edition of Why Wasn't It Better? As always, if you like what you hear, please subscribe, like us, follow us, do whatever you need to do. Tell people about us. We always appreciate it. Next week, we will be covering the 2011 MCU film Thor with another guest. So look forward to that.
Woo!
And we will see you then.